The War Council chamber was massive and filled with blinking lights and holographic displays that showed star maps and battle plans from across. 3 spiral arms of the galaxy and Grand Admiral Kelthos stood in the center of it all, studying the projections with his 4 ancient eyes that had witnessed centuries upon centuries of warfare and conquest. But something felt wrong today, and he could not shake the feeling of unease that crawled up his spine. Like ice water, his species, the Vryn, had built the greatest empire the galaxy had ever seen, and they had done it through pure mathematics and calculation and predictive algorithms that could forecast every battle outcome 300 moves in advance, and they had never lost. A war where the numbers favored them because they eliminated all chaos from warfare and turned it into a science as precise as physics itself. Tactical Liaison approached with nervous clicks of his mandibles and announced that the humans had deployed Unit 17 to the Threshold Sector in Kelthos. Felt both his hearts skip a beat because that designation had become something of a ghost story among the galactic military elite. And it was a name that made even the most battle-hardened commanders pause and reconsider their strategies. Unit 17 consisted of only 3 beings, and on paper it should have been laughable to think that 3 individuals could matter in a war spanning 14 contested worlds with millions of troops and thousands of warships. But the reports told a different story, and Kelthos had read every classified document about them and had memorized every detail, even though the details made no sense according to any known laws of warfare or physics. Lieutenant Maya Brooks was a human female, barely 30 years old, with standard military training and decent tactical scores, but nothing that would mark her as exceptional among her species, and yet she was the one who led Unit 17. And somehow she had survived encounters that should have killed her 100 times over, and her record showed impossible victories against overwhelming odds. Then there was the elf woman called Lyrene, and this was where things became truly disturbing. Because the Altherian species had vanished from the galaxy over 2 million years ago, and every xenohistorian agreed that they had gone extinct or evolved beyond physical form or simply left this dimension entirely. But here was one of them alive and bonded to a human soldier, and the implications of that alone were enough to keep strategists awake in their hibernation pods. The dragon called Ember was perhaps the most troubling element of all, because dragons were supposed to be mythological creatures from human folklore, and yet genetic scans confirmed that Ember existed and was real and displayed quantum-level consciousness that no laboratory could replicate, and the creature somehow existed partially in multiple dimensional states simultaneously, which should have been impossible according to every law of physics the Vryn had mastered over their long civilization. The Warmind officer spoke up with crystalline form, pulsing confidently, and stated that their probability matrices gave them a 97% chance of victory in the Threshold Sector because the math was simple, and 1 human and 1 mythological creature and 1 supposedly extinct species could not hold 14 worlds against the full might of the Vryn war machine. But Kelthos had seen the classified reports from other campaigns, and he knew what had happened. At the Crimson Nebula, where Unit 17 had turned a certain defeat into an impossible victory, and at Outpost Meridian, where they had somehow convinced an entire garrison to surrender without firing a shot, and at the shattered rings of Koroth, where the local reality had temporarily stopped making sense, and when it started again, the Vryn forces had retreated in confusion and terror. Wherever Unit 17 appeared, the mathematics of warfare simply broke down and stopped working, and outcomes that should have been impossible became routine, and strategies that should have guaranteed victory led to bewildering defeats. And it was as if the 3 of them together created some kind of probability distortion field that made the universe stop following its own rules. Kelthos gave orders to increase surveillance and to prepare evacuation protocols for their forward bases, and his officers exchanged confused glances because they could not understand why their admiral was so worried about 3 individuals when they had armies numbering in the millions. But the officers had learned not to question their admirals' instincts, because those instincts had kept them alive through 3 centuries of warfare. He turned back to the viewport and watched distant stars flicker and wondered where exactly Maya Brooks was at this moment and what she was planning, because somewhere out there she was already moving, and with her moved variables that his war minds could not calculate and could not predict and could not defend. against the Viren Empire had conquered 73 different species using pure statistical warfare, and they had perfected the art of turning battle into mathematics, and they had built prediction engines that could forecast outcomes with 99.9% accuracy, and they had never lost a campaign where the numbers favored them this heavily with such overwhelming force advantage, but they had never faced a human who had somehow befriended a dragon that sang mathematics into reality itself, and they had never fought against an elf whose very existence seemed to rewrite the laws of probability on a quantum level, and they had never encountered three beings who worked together with such perfect synchronization that they functioned as a single organism with capabilities far exceeding what any individual could achieve. The game had changed, and Kelthus knew it, even if his officers did not, and the change was not in their favor, because for the first time in his long military career, he was facing an enemy that his computers could not model, and his algorithms could not predict, and his war minds could not outsmart Maya. Brooks was not just a soldier, and Lyrian was not just an elf, and Ember was not just a dragon, and together they were something entirely new, and something that the galaxy had never seen before, and something that made the foundations of calculated warfare crumble like sandcastles. Before an incoming Tidukathos stood alone in his command center, surrounded by technology that had conquered most of the known galaxy, and for the first time in 300 years he felt genuine fear creeping into his hearts, because he was about to face an enemy that existed outside his understanding and outside his ability to predict, and he suspected that no amount of superior numbers or advanced technology would save him from what was coming. The holographic displays continued to flicker with troop movements and resource allocations and probability calculations that all showed certain victory, but Kelthus no longer trusted those numbers, because Unit 17 had taught the galaxy a harsh lesson, and that lesson was that some things could not be calculated, and some variables could not be predicted, and some battles were not won by whoever had the better math. Maya Brooks crouched low in the shadows of a collapsed transit station on the surface of Threshold 7, and her breathing remained steady despite the thunderous sounds of orbital bombardment that shook the ground in the distance and beside her. The elf woman Lyrian studied a handheld scanner with eyes that glowed faintly silver in the darkness, while above them, both coiled around the skeletal remains of a broken communications tower, the dragon Ember watched the burning skyline with ancient knowing. A Slarin spoke softly in her melodic voice that seemed to carry notes and frequencies just beyond what human ears could normally detect. And she said that the Vrin forces were pulling back from sectors 9 through 12, which meant that the Admiral knew they were here, and that their presence had already begun to affect enemy strategy, even though they had not yet fired a single shot. Maya smiled grimly at this news, because it was exactly what she wanted and the Vrin needed. To know that Unit 17 had arrived on the planet because fear and uncertainty were weapons, just as powerful as guns and bombs, and sometimes more effective, in the Vrin Empire, had built everything on the foundation of mathematical certainty. So introducing uncertainty into their calculations was half the battle. Vrin waged warfare like a chess game played by supercomputers, and every piece was calculated, and every outcome was predicted hundreds of moves in advance, and they had conquered most of the galaxy because they had eliminated chaos and randomness from the battlefield and turned war into a pure science, where the side with better numbers and better algorithms always won. But Maya Brooks represented chaos in its purest form, and her companions were variables that should not exist in any mathematical equation, and together they broke every rule that the Vrin had written about how warfare should work. Maya asked Ember if he could taste the surveillance grid that the Vrin had deployed around their position, and the dragon unfurled his massive wings that shimmered with colors that had no names in any human language, and when Ember spoke, his voice resonated, not in ears, but directly in minds, and he reported 17 satellites in orbit, and 43 ground stations, and 12 cloaked drones within half a kilometer, and the Vrin were watching everything with sensors that could detect a mouse breathing from orbit. Maya said that this was good because she wanted them to watch what came next, and she pulled out a small device that looked like nothing more than an old, battered music player, and it was something that would not attract any attention from military scanners because it appeared completely harmless and unimportant. Leanne asked if Maya was ready, and the elf woman's smile was unsettling and ancient and devastating all at once. Because her people had been manipulating probability fields when humans were still learning to make fire, and the Altherian had evolved beyond normal physical limitations and could see and touch things that existed in quantum states and could make possibilities become realities just by observing them correctly. This was the secret that kept the galaxy's greatest strategists awake at night and unable to rest, because Maya was not just a soldier, but rather a conductor who orchestrated impossible things, and Lorene was not just an elf, but a living quantum computer who could perceive probability threads. The way most species perceived light and color in Ember was not just a dragon, but a bridge between dimensions, and a creature who existed partially in spaces where causality itself became flexible and negotiable. Together, they did not fight battles in any conventional sense, and instead they rewrote the battles themselves and changed the fundamental rules and made reality bend to accommodate outcomes that should have been impossible. Maya activated her device, and Lorene began to hum, and the sound was beautiful and terrible at the same time, and it was like hearing a mathematical proof expressed as music, and it made local reality start to bend and flex in ways that should not have been possible, and Ember joined in with draconic harmonics that wove through the elf's melody like golden threads through silver fabrics. Suddenly, the Vryn surveillance grid began seeing ghosts and phantoms and impossible things, because 17 different Drachis, Maya Brooks, appeared across the planet simultaneously. In 43 different versions of Ember filled the sky in different locations, and Lyrian's probability manipulation made each phantom image feel completely real and register on every type of sensor as genuine and authentic. The Vryn scanners could not tell which images were real and which were probability echoes, and their war minds locked up trying to process the contradiction of one person existing in 17 places at once with identical biosignatures and quantum markers. Lyrian lowered her scanner calmly and stated that the Vryn would now spend the next 6 hours minimum chasing shadows and phantom images across the planet, and by the time they realized what had happened, Unit 17 would have already reached the Central Command bunker and accomplished their real objective. Maya checked her rifle, which was a weapon she rarely used but always carried just in case, and she told her companions that it was time to introduce the Vryn to something their war minds could not predict or calculate, and that something was human improvisation combined with elven probability manipulation, combined with draconic reality distortion, all working together in perfect synchronization. They moved through the burning city like smoke and like shadows and like probability waves that existed everywhere and nowhere at the same time, and they were three beings who had somehow found each other across impossible odds and distances and had become something far greater than the sum of their individual parts behind them across the planet. The greatest military force in the galaxy scrambled to respond to an enemy that existed in 17 places simultaneously and also existed in none of those places, and their sensors kept giving contradictory readings, and their war minds kept crashing and rebooting as they tried to make sense of data that violated every rule of physics and mathematics. Somewhere high in orbit, Grand Admiral Kelthos watched his perfect predictions dissolve into chaos and confusion and wondered if his empire had finally encountered an opponent they could not defeat through superior numbers and better calculations. The three members of Unit 17 moved with purpose and confidence through enemy territory, and they did not move like soldiers trying to hide, but rather like forces of nature that simply existed and flowed around obstacles. And Maya thought about how strange and wonderful it was that she had found these two impossible friends, and how they had changed her life and given her purpose beyond just following orders. Slarian had taught her that reality was not as solid as people believed, and that with the right perspective you could see the probability threads that connected all possible outcomes, and learn to pull on those threads and make unlikely things become likely and make impossible things become merely improbable. Ember had shown her that dimensions were not separate but overlapping and interpenetrating, and that a being who understood this could exist in multiple states simultaneously, and could draw power from realms that most species did not even know existed. Together, the three of them had discovered that friendship and trust and perfect synchronization could create something that no military academy taught and no strategic computer could model, and they had become living proof that some forces in the universe were stronger than mathematics and more powerful than technology. The command bunker loomed ahead in the distance, and Maya knew that inside that bunker sat an admiral who was probably terrified right now because his entire worldview was collapsing, and she almost felt sorry for him because the Vrin had built everything on certainty. And control in Unit 17 represented the opposite of those things. But wars were not won by feeling sorry for the enemy, and Maya had a job to do, and that job was to convince the Vrin Empire to leave the Threshold worlds alone, and to stop their expansion, and to learn that not everything in the galaxy could be conquered through mathematics. She looked at Lirin and at Ember, and saw in their eyes the same determination and the same loyalty and the same love that bound them together, stronger than any chain or contract, and she knew that whatever happened next, they would face it together as they always did. The command bunker on Threshold 7 was a masterpiece of Vrin engineering, and it stretched 3 kilometers deep beneath a mountain with walls made of reinforced uranium that could withstand direct hits from orbital weapons, and it was protected by enough defensive systems to hold off an entire fleet in Grand Admiral. Kelthos had positioned himself there personally to coordinate the defense of all 14 worlds from what should have been an absolutely impregnable fortress. He watched his tactical displays with mounting frustration as they showed Unit 17 appearing in 17 different locations all across the planet. Simultaneously, in each location registered identical biosignatures and heat outputs and genetic markers, and mass readings, and his war minds, which were artificial intelligences that had out-hot organic commanders for thousands of years, were now locked in processing loops trying to determine which Maya Brooks was the real one, the tactical officer. Reported with confusion bleeding through his normally emotionless voice that all of the signatures registered as identical and perfect copies, and that it was completely impossible to determine which one was genuine based on any known scanning. Technologic Elitos growled in frustration and ordered his people to run deep quantum scans because quantum signatures could not be faked or copied, but the response came back that they had already tried quantum scanning and the results were even more confusing because the quantum signatures were shifting and changing, and the elf was apparently doing something to local probability fields that made their sensors unable to distinguish between what was possible and what was actual. Kelthos felt something he had not experienced in 300 years of warfare, and that feeling was genuine fear, because the Vrin had built their entire empire on mathematical certainty, and they did not gamble, or improvise, or take chances, and instead, they calculated absolute outcomes, and then enacted those outcomes with mechanical precision. But Maya Brooks did not appear anywhere in their equations, and Lirin, the last of the Altherian, was a member of a species that had evolved beyond normal Spacetime, and Ember the dragon was a creature that their xenobiologists insisted could not exist under any known laws of physics. A sensor officer called out urgently that they were detecting a probability cascade in Section 7, and that reality confidence levels were dropping to 62%, and Kelthos demanded to know what that even meant, because he had never heard of reality having confidence levels before anyone could provide an explanation. The lights in the command bunker flickered, and it was not from any power disruption but from something far more disturbing, because the flickers suggested that existence itself had briefly considered not powering the lights, and had then decided to power them after all. Then Maya Brooks was simply there standing in the center of the command bunker, and she had not come through any door or used any teleportation device, but had simply transitioned from not being there to being there as Lirin bent the probability of her location and made her impossible position become her actual position. The elf stood beside Maya, humming that haunting melody that made even the most seasoned warriors clutch their heads in pain as the sound rewrote local causality and made reality flexible in ways that biological brains were not equipped to process. Sember coiled around both of his companions, and somehow The massive dragon fit within the confines of the bunker, despite being far too large for the space, and his eyes swirled with colors that hurt to look at because perceiving them meant glimpsing dimensions that Vryn brains had not evolved to understand. Kilotos tried to maintain his composure and stated that they were surrounded by 4,000 troops and outgunned 1,000,000 to 1, and that their supplies were limited and their options were non-existent. Maya interrupted him calmly and said that all of those facts were irrelevant because he was still thinking in terms of conventional warfare. And that was exactly why he had already lost this battle before it even began. Larian shifted the pitch of her humming, and suddenly every weapon in the entire bunker developed simultaneous malfunctions, and these were not mechanical failures, but probability failures where ammunition that was definitely loaded became possibly unloaded, and in quantum spaces, possibility always trumped certain. Kilotos tried desperately to buy time for his war minds to formulate some kind of response, and he said that the Altherian had been wiped out because they threatened galactic order, and that Lyrine was the last of her Kindlerine. Spoke for the first time, and her voice carried harmonics that made the bunker walls vibrate, and she said that he was wrong because she was not the last of her kind, but rather the first to return because her people had not died, but had instead evolved beyond the ability of most species to perceive them, and they had existed in higher dimensional spaces for millions of years. But this human had called out across dimensions, and some things transcended even dimension itself, and friendship was apparently one of those things. Ember rumbled, and the sound contained words in a language that was older than galaxies, and he said that the three of them were bound together in ways that Vryn mathematics could never express, and where one of them stood, all three existed. And what one perceived, all three knew, and the Vryn could not fight them because they could not even properly define what they were fighting against. Maya stepped forward. Somehow 4,000 highly trained soldiers found themselves completely unable to pull their triggers, and it was not from fear, but from a sudden existential uncertainty about whether pulling triggers was actually a possible action in this specific bubble of space-time that Lyrine had created. Maya stated calmly what was going to happen next, and she said that the Vryn would withdraw from all 14 threshold worlds immediately, and they would leave the independent colonies alone from now on. And they would tell every strategist in the Vryn Empire exactly why they were withdrawing. Kalidas asked why he would possibly agree to do that even, though he already knew the answer deep in his heart's my eyes. Smile was both kind and absolutely terrifying at the same time, and she explained that they were not just three individual beings, but rather they were proof that the entire Vryn doctrine was fundamentally wrong because you could not calculate friendship, and you could not predict loyalty, and you could not quantify what happened when three impossible beings decided to stand together and face the universe side by side. And if the Vryn tried to fight them, then Lyrine would make their probability of existence become negotiable. The elf woman's eyes flashed bright silver, and for one single horrifying instant, Grand Admiral Kelthos experienced what it meant to simultaneously exist and not exist, and to be alive and to never have been born, and the sensation lasted only a microsecond, but it shattered something fundamental in his understanding of reality and existence itself. He whispered the word withdraw, and it was barely audible even in the sudden silence of the command center. His tactical officer questioned the order with confusion, and Kelthos roared at the top of his lungs for them to withdraw immediately and to execute a full retreat from all worlds, and to send the order across all military channels with maximum priorities. His officers scrambled to comply with the unexpected orders. Maya nodded once in acknowledgement and told the Admiral that he had made a smart choice and that he should inform all the other powers in the galaxy that humanity no longer stood alone because humans had found friends in impossible places, and together they were a variable that no equation would ever be able to solve. Then Unit 17 was simply gone, and they had not walked away or teleported, but had simply ceased to be present in that location as Lyrine folded probability around them like someone folding. Oblonka Kelthos sank down into his command chair and felt for centuries of military doctrine and strategic thinking crumbling inside his mind like ancient ruins, and the Vryn Empire had just learned an extremely expensive lesson, which was that some battles could not be won with superior numbers or better technology, or more advanced algorithms. News of what had happened in the threshold sector spread through the galaxy like quantum entanglement, and it was instantaneous and unstoppable and profoundly disturbing to every military power that had based their entire strategic doctrine on mathematical certainty and predictable outcomes, and within one standard galactic week, Maya, Brooks, and Lyrian and Ember had become the most analyzed and most discussed tactical unit in all of known space in the crystalline war chambers of the Hexate. Coalition military generals whose minds operated across 17 parallel thought streams simultaneously tried desperately to create computer models of Unit 17. But every single simulation ended in probability collapse, and every prediction terminated in undefined variables, and every analysis came back with error messages that should not have been possible. War Coordinator Zixathon spoke with their voice resonating through quantum-linked decision nodes and stated that the human female was unremarkable by herself with standard military training and above-average tactical intuition, but nothing that would mark her as exceptional or noteworthy among her own species. But Strategist Prime countered this assessment by pointing out that she was never by herself, and that was the entire point they were missing, because the elf was an Altherian, and they had ancient records about that species, and those records were terrifying because the Altherian had not just manipulated probability but had existed partially outside causality itself and trying to fight. One was like trying to punch a probability wave or wrestle with quantum uncertainty. Someone in the chamber asked about the dragon and what their analysis had revealed. About that creature, a long, uncomfortable silence descended over the entire war chamber. Because nobody had good data on Ember, and the creature appeared on their sensors, but its quantum signature suggested that it existed simultaneously in multiple different dimensional states, and some scans showed it as organic, while other scans showed it as pure energy, and still other scans showed it as something that had absolutely no classification in any of their xenobiological database. Seshathan spoke slowly and carefully and said that what concerned them most was not what the three beings were individually, but rather what they had become together, because their analysis suggested that Unit 17 had formed something that had previously only existed in theoretical papers, and that something was a tripartite quantum consciousness, where three separate minds operated in perfect synchronization as a single tactical entity with capabilities that far exceeded the sum of the individual parts. A junior analyst spoke up nervously and asked whether they should add Unit 17 to their restricted engagement list, which was a list of enemies that coalition forces were ordered to avoid at all costs. Strategist Prime said firmly that they should not add them to the restricted list, but instead should create an entirely new category, and they should call it Undefined Threat Matrix, and they should recommend that all coalition forces avoid engagement unless absolutely necessary. For survival, and if engagement did become necessary, then forces should surrender immediately and hope desperately that Unit 17 was feeling merciful that day. Meanwhile, in the diplomatic corridors of the Galactic Assembly, representatives from 300 different species argued endlessly about what they were now calling the Maya Brooks question, and they debated whether Unit 17 was a rogue military asset, or a new faction, or a threat to galactic stability. Ambassador Chen, 3 of the reformed human territories, stood before the full assembly with her mechanical enhancements glowing softly as she addressed the gathered representatives, and she stated clearly that Maya Brooks was still technically a lieutenant. In the Human Defense Forces, though, she operated with extreme autonomy, but she wanted everyone to understand that Maya was not humanity's weapon and was not under anyone's direct controls. She explained that Maya Brooks was a person who had made friends with beings who should not exist according to conventional understanding, and that together they had decided to protect those who could not protect themselves, and that made them unpredictable, but not necessarily dangerous unless you were. The kind of power that preyed on the weakened representative from the Kryn hegemony roared with tentacles, thrashing in agitation, and declared that unpredictability was itself dangerous because it created instability, and instability led to chaos, and chaos led to suffering. Ambassador Chen 3 countered calmly that predictability could be just as dangerous because the Vryn Empire had been utterly predictable, and they had calculated and conquered and enslaved countless species, and perhaps what the galaxy truly needed was someone who could not be calculated and someone who made empires think twice before launching their next war of conquest. From all the political debates and strategic analysis sessions in a small, quiet cafe, on the orbital station called Crossroads 9, Maya Brooks sat across a table from her two closest friends, and she was drinking something that approximated coffee, while Ember had taken a smaller form no larger than a house cat and was perched. On the table between them and Leorine was sipping water that somehow tasted like captured starlight. Maya said with a wry smile that they had become famous, or perhaps infamous. And she had not yet decided which description was more accurate. Tellurian replied with her ageless eyes twinkling with amusement that they were probably both famous and infamous at the same time. Because her people used to be famous too before they had decided that fame was not worth the trouble in being feared for. Your abilities got tedious after the first few millennia of dealing with Atember, rumbled with a sound like distant thunder wrapped in contentment, and said that he did not care if others feared them or wondered about them, as long as those others left innocent beings alone and stopped their campaigns of conquest and oppression. Maya looked at her two impossible friends and thought about how strange her life had become because she had been just another soldier following orders until the day she had found an injured elf in an abandoned temple and had chosen to help instead of walking away. And then she had met a dragon trapped between dimensions and had offered friendship when she could have offered nothing. She said quietly that the galaxy would test them again eventually because someone would always think they had found the formula or the strategy to defeat. Unit 17, Leanne reached across the table and squeezed Maya's hand gently and said that when that day came, they would teach those challengers the same lesson they had taught the Vryn Empire, which was that some things simply could not be calculated because friendship and trust and love were the true weapons that won wars, and not because they were powerful in conventional terms, but because they created unity and synchronization that mathematics could never predict or model. Ember shifted and flowed back into his massive form with wings, spreading through probability space so they were simultaneously visible and invisible, and occupying the cafe, and not occupying it at the same time. And he said that he quite enjoyed being the thing. That made Strategists uneasy, because it was refreshing after spending eons being forgotten or dismissed as mere mythology. Maya laughed, and the sound carried through the station, making nearby species pause and smile without really knowing why. Because there was something magical in that laugh, and not the probability manipulation kind of magic, but the human kind of magic that came from genuine joy and friendship. She raised her cup in a toast and said they should drink to being undefined variables in everyone's equation. Solarian clinked her glass against Maya's cup and added that they should also toast to making strategists nervous and keeping them on their toes. Ember concluded the toast with his voice a warm rumble and said they should toast to friendship that transcended dimension and species and possibility itself across the entire galaxy. In 1,000 different war rooms and strategy centers and command bunkers, military minds continued to struggle with trying to understand Unit 17, and they built models and ran simulations and analyzed data, but they would never succeed in their attempts because some things could not be reduced to numbers and equations. You could not calculate the strength that came from genuine friendship, and you could not quantify the loyalty that bound three impossible beings together, and you could not predict what would happen when those three decided to face infinity side by side, and that more than any weapon or tactic or strategy was exactly why the galaxy's greatest strategists remained uneasy whenever they thought about that single human unit. 3 months had passed since the incident at Threshold 7, and the entire galaxy had quietly reorganized itself around what military analysts were now calling the Maya Brooks variable, and trade routes had shifted to avoid potential conflict zones where Unit 17 might appear without warning, and military academies across dozens of species had added entirely new courses on something they called undefined warfare. and the Vryn Empire had quietly and without much fanfare abandoned 12% of their occupied territories but peace, as Maya had learned during her short military career was always temporary, and conflicts always found ways to resurface in new forms. Message arrived through a quantum channel that should not have existed according to any known communications technology, and it was encoded in mathematics so complex and dense that perceiving it directly caused physical pain, and Lyrine spent 2 hours decoding the transmission while Ember provided dimensional stability to prevent the message from collapsing spacetime around their current location, which was a small, peaceful, agricultural world called Havens Reslarian. Finally finished her work and spoke with an edge of worry in her voice that Maya had never heard before, and she said that the message was from beings called the Architects, and these were the ones who had given the Vryn their war minds centuries ago and who had designed half the strategic systems currently in use. Across the galaxy, Maya asked what the Architects wanted, though she suspected she already knew the Ansrelarian. Paused while reading deeper into the layers of the message, and then said that the Architects wanted to meet with them and to understand them and to analyze them because, according to the message, Unit 17 had broken 3,000 years of careful mathematical modeling and had introduced chaos into a galaxy that the Risa Architects had spent millennia organizing, and they considered this chaos to be a threat to stability itself. Ember raised his massive head, and his eyes swirled with colors that conveyed concern and worry, and he said that the Architects were not beings who negotiated or compromised because they calculated optimal outcomes and then executed those outcomes with absolute precision, and if they had decided that Unit 17 was a threat to their ordered galaxy, then they would attempt to eliminate that threat using probability weapons that could make existence itself unlikely enough that targeted beings would simply cease to be. Maya felt her stomach tighten with nervousness, but she had already faced down an entire empire and survived, so she could certainly face mysterious cosmic Architects. And she said that they would meet with the Architects, but only on Unit 17's terms and in a location of their choosing them. Meeting place ended up being a space station called the Nexus, and it was older than most current civilizations, and it floated at the exact gravitational center of the galaxy where multiple dimensional streams intersected, and the Architects maintained it as neutral ground and as a place where even the normal rules of reality were considered flexible and negotiable. When Maya and Lyrine and Ember arrived at the Nexus, they found themselves facing 3 beings that were difficult to look at directly. And not because they were ugly or frightening, but because they were too mathematically perfect, and they were ideals, given physical form and entities that existed as pure order in a universe that naturally preferred chaos and randomness. Architect designated Prime spoke in a voice that sounded like equations being solved in real time and stated that Unit 17 was an anomaly in 3 variables that interacted in ways that could not be predicted or modeled, and that they had disrupted 16 major conflicts and collapsed for different predictive models and caused 7 entire species to abandon mathematical warfare entirely. Maya responded calmly, though her heart was racing, and said that it sounded like they had been keeping busy. Prime continued and said that Unit 17 must cease all activities immediately because their existence introduced uncertainty where there should be perfect order, and that wars were fought using calculation because calculation minimized overall suffering, and that random unpredictable outcomes led to chaos, and chaos eventually led to extinction. Level Even Slarian stepped forward with her eyes blazing with power that was millions of years old, and she said with great respect that the Architect was completely wrong because they were mistaking rigid order for genuine peace, and that they had created a galaxy where everyone's fate was predetermined by algorithms. And that was not peace, but rather a prison where nobody had real choices. Second Architect, designated Sigma, argued that they had saved trillions of lives over thousands of years through their predictive models that prevented conflicts and minimized casualties. Maya interjected and asked what the cost of that salvation had been, because she had personally visited worlds that operated under Architect oversight, and yes, fewer people died in battles, but they also stopped truly living because everyone was so afraid of disrupting the precious calculations that they stopped taking chances and stopped growing. and stopped being anything more than variables in someone else's equations. Ember unfurled his wings, and suddenly the entire Nexus station was filled with his presence, not physically, but dimensionally, and he existed in spaces that the architects had not accounted for, and he said in his ancient, rumbling voice that the architects were young, despite all their arrogance, because he had existed since before mathematics in places where reality itself was still forming and negotiable, and he had watched entire universes bloom into existence and fade away, and he could tell them with absolute certainty that certainty itself was death, and that life was chaos and beautiful and terrifying, and that these two beings beside him represented what the architects feared most, which was proof that their perfect order was nothing but an elaborate illusion. The third architect, designated Omega, leaned forward and stated that they had no choice now, and that they must eliminate Unit 17 completely, and they had calculated 37 different probability weapons, and each one was specifically designed to make the existence of Maya and Lyrian and Ember statistically impossible across all timelines simultaneously, and they could unmake them so thoroughly that it would be as if they had never existed at all. The threat hung in the air of the station like a death sentence waiting to be carried out. But Maya smiled, and it was not a smile of bravery, but rather a smile of understanding. She said quietly, but firmly, that no, they could not do that. Prime demanded that she explain her reasoning. Maya gestured toward the viewport where dozens of ships were peering out of faster-than-light travel, and there were ships from the Vrin Empire, and from the Hexate Coalition, and from the reformed human territories, and even a few ships from the Kryn hegemony, and species that normally could not agree on anything were all arriving together. She explained that the architects wanted to eliminate Unit 17 to preserve their version of stability, but something unexpected had happened. Instead, because Maya and Lyrian and Ember had become a symbol that meant something to billions of beings across the galaxy, transmission crackled through the station's communication system, and it was from Grand Admiral Kelthus of the Vrin Empire, and he stated formally that the Vrin were present to speak against the elimination of Unit 17, because yes, they had been defeated by these three beings, but in that defeat, they had learned that their entire military doctrine had been fundamentally flawed, and Unit 17 had given them something they had lost over centuries of calculated warfare, and that something was the ability to adapt and to change more transmissions, followed from the Hexate Coalition and the Human Defense Forces and dozens of other species, and many of these species had never agreed on anything throughout their entire histories, but they were all united now in one single message, which was that Unit 17 had changed something fundamental about how the galaxy understood conflict, and warfare. Lyrian spoke gently and said that the architects could not eliminate them without proving the very point that Unit 17 had been making all along, because the moment they used their probability weapons, they would be admitting that mathematics could not solve everything, and that chaos and uncertainty had their place in the universe, and they would lose either way regardless of what they chose. The three architects stood in silence for a long moment, and their perfect mathematical forms flickered and wavered as they processed this impossible situation, because they had built their entire existence on being able to calculate every possible outcome, but they had not calculated friendship, and they had not predicted inspiration, and they had not been able to quantify hope. Finally, Prime spoke and admitted that this situation was unprecedented in their long existence. Maya said with a slight grin that they should get used to unprecedented situations, because Unit 17 represented a new normal for the galaxy. Omega tilted their head and asked what exactly Unit 17 wanted from them. Maya replied that they wanted the same thing they had always wanted, which was freedom for people to make their own choices, and wars that were fought because they were truly necessary, and not because an algorithm said conflict was optimal, and a galaxy where three impossible friends could exist together without threatening the cosmic order. Sigma said slowly that Maya was asking them to embrace uncertainty and randomness.